What if I told you that Comet Atlas no longer behaves like an ordinary celestial body? What if its tail, dust trails, and brightness aren't just physics, but something more, resembling the shape of a tongue? It would seem that we live in a world of exact science, where every object in space obeys strict laws of orbit, heating, decay, and solar pressure. But recent weeks of scientific monitoring have upended everything we knew about the behavior of interstellar objects. And today, we'll consider a hypothesis that sounds crazy, but explains too many coincidences to ignore. The hypothesis that Atlas isn't just a visitor from afar, not just an icy body. Perhaps it's an instrument, or a recording, or a warning. The first warning sign was a change in the comet's brightness in spectra previously used exclusively to study solar plasma emissions. Scientists noticed strange fluctuations in luminosity. They appeared and disappeared with such regularity that they resembled a human pulse. The rhythm, shape, and recurrence seemed encoded. Something similar was observed in 1997 with comet Hale-Bopp, but at the time, the phenomenon was dismissed as a rare optical illusion. However, Atlas repeated the pattern several times in a row, with an accuracy of tenths of a second. This is no longer a coincidence. It is a pattern. But the most incredible thing happened when a group of amateur astrophotographers from South Korea posted an image online, taken with a narrow OOAI filter, typically used to observe supernova remnants. In the photo, the tail of Atlas formed a shape reminiscent of a map, more precisely, the outline of the western coast of South America. At first, it looked like a simple trick of the light. But 5 days later, an earthquake occurred off the coast of Chile, a magnitude 5.7 earthquake. Nothing catastrophic, but it struck exactly the spot that the image strangely resembled. Coincidence? Possibly, but then things got worse. A week later, another telescope detected a change in the structure of the dust plume, this time an elongated elliptical shape resembling a heat map. It would have gone unnoticed if not for an X-class solar flare 3 days later, which caused brief communications disruptions on several continents. Scientists from the European Southern Observatory published a report cautiously suggesting a possible connection between the comet's dust structure and future solar events. Formally, they don't confirm anything, but between the lines, it reads something else. Such behavior has never been observed before. And here's where things begin to move beyond classical astrophysics. Observations with the H-alpha filter revealed dark streaks within the tail of Atlas that seemed to appear along a predetermined line. They weren't ejecta or camera artifacts. The lines formed a pattern, not random, not chaotic. It was repeating. And a scientist from the University of Tokyo, Professor Akira Matsumoto, noticed that these streaks perfectly matched the areas where a powerful storm front occurred on the Earth's surface 2 weeks later, nearly triggering a hurricane on the US coast. Coincidence number 3, and again, too precise to ignore. They began digging deeper. They used filters not previously used on comets, enhanced contrast, and overlaid spectral maps. And the more data they collected, the clearer it became. Atlas's tail was behaving as if something or someone was using it as a canvas. The shape of the trail was changing too quickly, too non-linearly, too deliberately, given the estimated particle flow velocities. It seemed as if the comet was reacting to the solar wind, not mechanically, but dynamically, as if adjusting its pattern in real time. But the main thing was the temporal coincidences. After each recorded pattern, literally days later, related events occurred. Tectonic shifts, magnetic field changes, unexpected surges in cosmic radiation. At first, it looked like a series of rare but possible coincidences, then like a statistical error. But after the 5th instance, even skeptics began to wonder. Now imagine, if a comet truly records future events, whether natural or cosmic, then how does it do so? Is it a forecast, or a recording, or a route it has already taken? And if so, who was its creator, or its observer? Currently, there are 3 strong hypotheses, each seemingly outlandish, but explaining some of the anomalies. The first is that Atlas is a fragment of an ancient star system, where similar structures form naturally, but their changes reflect processes in the interstellar medium. The second is that the comet carries elements sensitive to gravitational fluctuations, allowing it to preemptively form patterns based on the faintest signals from space. The third, the most dangerous, is that it is an artificial object, created millions of years ago by a civilization that used comets as books recording the history of the world. All 3 hypotheses sound improbable, but in the case of Atlas, improbability is the new normal. The comet's tail begins to behave as if it were responding not to the laws of nature, but to an invisible hand shaping its shape. And if this is true, what exactly is she trying to tell us? The more we looked at Atlas, the less it resembled a natural object. At some point, researchers began to feel as if we weren't observing the comet, we were reading it. Like a book, a map, an ancient text written in the language of light, dust, and ionized gases. And the longer the observations continued, the more difficult it became to explain what we were seeing with pure physics, because Atlas's tail was changing in a very deliberate way. It wasn't simply expanding under the influence of the solar wind, but forming patterns that seemed to echo the contours of future catastrophes. But the key moment was an experiment no one had planned. It happened by chance, on the night the Subaru telescope in Hawaii was switched to multispectral imaging mode. In one of the frames, astronomer Mark Rivers noticed a strange pattern. The lines and light transitions in the comet's tail formed something resembling a topographic map. But a map of what? No one knew yet. The answer came 3 weeks later. The Turan Plain in Central Asia, a vast region considered geologically stable for centuries, suddenly erupted with a powerful seismic surge. Not catastrophic, but anomalous, and the most astonishing thing was that the epicenter's outline matched the very same image in the photograph. It was as if the comet had predicted the future deformation of the Earth's crust. Scientists tried to find an explanation. They talked about the parallelism effect, about how the human brain searches for patterns, even where there are none. But then, new coincidences followed. Unusual dust curves that suddenly reproduced the boundaries of a future cyclone. A strange darkening in the central tail, coinciding with a region where a local magnetic failure later occurred. And even a structure of weak luminosity that replicated the shape of a future solar flare. With each new anomaly, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the official stance of coincidence. Especially when independent astronomers began to weigh in, using their own filters and obtaining the same results. The picture became all too clear. The Atlas tail isn't just a physical phenomenon. It behaves like a dynamic record of future events. But how is this possible? There's a theory that's only discussed behind closed doors, and which official institutions will never voice publicly. It builds on ideas once proposed by Carl Sagan and refined by modern physicists. The theory posits that an object of interstellar origin could be a fragment of an ancient megastructure that uses dust and plasma tails as data carriers, responding to the slightest interdimensional fluctuations. In other words, the tail is a kind of indicator of future events, if the events are large enough to have their echo propagate through space-time. At first, this seems like scientific fantasy. But let's remember, gravitational waves, predicted by Einstein, were considered fantasy for almost 100 years. And now we measure them. Quantum entropy, non-local interactions, the retrocausality hypothesis, all of this sounded crazy until it was experimentally confirmed. So perhaps we're dealing with an object that isn't simply flying through the solar system, but interacting with it, sensing impending stresses at the microscopic level, and responding by forming patterns that reflect these changes. But if this is so, then a much more disturbing question arises. Why now? Why are these messages directed specifically to Earth? Some scientists are convinced that a comet doesn't choose. It's simply an instrument, like an ancient seismograph of the universe, which over millions of years of wandering has learned to detect the weakest signals and convert them into visual form. In other words, it doesn't warn us, it records. And we're simply reading these records for the first time in history. But there's another, far more frightening view, that Atlas isn't an instrument of nature, but an instrument of intelligence, and that its route isn't random, that it's part of a vast observation system, created billions of years ago by a civilization that monitored the development of planets and recorded key points in their evolution. That each image in the tail is a record, but not just of past events. It's a prediction, and if this is true, then the main question arises, what will happen next? A new structure is now visible in images from several telescopes, an unusual, bright gap in the tail. It stretches into a shape reminiscent of a continental fault line. But what exactly this fault line is remains unclear. Scientists are working around the clock to understand the meaning of this new message, but time is ticking. And if the pattern persists, this new prediction could prove to be the most accurate and most dangerous. And for the first time in many years, among specialists who had always spoken only in the language of formulas, a word appeared that no one had previously spoken out loud. Warning. Observations of Atlas reached a whole new level after a burst wave was first detected in the comet's tail. A structure that in spectral analysis looked not like a chaotic stream of particles, but like a clearly defined signal. It was something like a flash, but not an optical one, a flash of information. A similar effect is sometimes observed in supernova remnants, but this was something different. Periodicity, repeatability, a formula. It was as if the comet wasn't simply shedding its tail, it was trying to maintain the shape of a message. At a meeting at the European Southern Observatory, Professor Caroline Hager first articulated what many had been thinking, but were afraid to say out loud: that the Atlas tail acts as a data modulation tool, like a transmitter, but in visual form. And a visual code, unlike radio signals, can be transmitted without the risk of distortion. It's drawn by matter itself. The tail's shape reflects changes in the gravitational field, plasma fluctuations, and subtle variations in solar pressure. But then a new oddity emerged. Some elements of the pattern were changing ahead of time, not as a consequence, but as a precursor to events. A similar anomaly has occurred only once before in history, in 1859, before the famous Carrington flare which knocked out the world's telegraph system. Then, a few hours before the explosion, sunspots took on a shape later dubbed a symmetrical arc. But this was a local effect of the star. This was an external object, and its behavior indicated that it was detecting fluctuations days or weeks in advance. But the most important thing happened that night, when the Cerro Ventana Observatory captured a new image of Atlas's tail, shaped like a map of the North Atlantic. The trail followed the contours of a future cyclone, even though the cyclone didn't yet exist. 11 days later, meteorologists announced the formation of an anomalously powerful storm, dubbed Hermes. Its trajectory replicated the pattern in the comet's tail to within tens of kilometers. This is where the skeptics capitulated. 3 coincidences are a fluke, 5 are a statistical error, 10 are an anomaly. But when the count reached the tens, even the most staunch rationalists began to consider the idea that Atlas interacts with space-time differently than any other object we know of. That's when non-local physicists entered the picture. They proposed a theory that sounds like science fiction, but it describes what's happening surprisingly well. The theory goes like this. If an object has a complex internal structure sensitive to ripples in space, and its material is capable of interacting with gravitational waves at an extremely low level, then the chaos of the tail may cease to be chaos. It turns into a mirror surface reflecting the hidden vibrations of the universe, including events that have not yet manifested themselves at full force. So the tail isn't a warning in the human sense. It's a projection, a hypersensitive screen that responds to signals that exist in physics long before the event becomes visible. An earthquake before the plate begins to move. A magnetic glitch before the field lines break. A solar flare while it's still forming. The problem was different. The patterns began to change more rapidly. In December, the tail structure suddenly changed so dramatically that it resembled a sudden jerk rather than a natural flow of particles. High contrast filters revealed spiral-like lines. These spirals, as was later discovered, replicated the configuration of magnetic rings that astronomers observed in Jupiter's magnetosphere 2 weeks later. This was the first time a comet depicted not a terrestrial event, but a cosmic one. Not a catastrophe, but a natural process. Does this mean the tail records any future anomaly within a certain radius? Or is this just the first time we've looked at the data closely enough? But the scientists' main fear lay elsewhere. If Atlas truly does record future events, then why do some of the tail structures look like maps of regions where events haven't yet occurred, but should? One of the final shapes in the images resembles the San Andreas Fault, only with expanded boundaries. No one wants to speculate on the possible consequences, but everyone understands that such a shape can't be random. And here a new branch of the hypothesis arises. If the tail reflects the future, then for the first time we may see not just a prediction, but the consequences of our own influence on the planet. Thermal anomalies, changes in the composition of the atmosphere, the level of radiation pollution. All of this could also be part of the physical language in which the comet depicts the universe. But if this is so, then the question that scares us more than all the others arises. If a comet writes the future, can we change it? Or is it already fixed? And if it is recorded, then by whom? When astronomers first began matching the patterns in Atlas's tail with future events on Earth, a mixture of panic, excitement, and severe skepticism reigned in the scientific community. But when the coincidences began to repeat themselves again and again, with a precision that couldn't be explained by statistics alone, many began to talk not about physics, but about intention. After all, any phenomenon that manifests itself regularly, meaningfully, and in advance ceases to be simply a natural process. It becomes information, and information is always communication. After a series of coincidences, Atlas began searching for a deeper structure in its tail, and they found it. At first, it was a faint line, echoing the contours of the region around Iceland. 3 weeks later, strong seismic tremors began there. Then, a thick, bright gap, seemingly cutting through space in an arc. This arc almost perfectly coincided with the region in the upper atmosphere, where a sharp spike in cosmic radiation later occurred. But most alarming was the appearance of map-like figures in the tail that couldn't correspond to Earth. These were structures more reminiscent of the surfaces of other planets or moons. In particular, the contours of Europa, a moon of Jupiter, where signs of subglacial oceans were discovered years ago. Is it possible that the comet is recording not only our own processes, but also those of distant celestial bodies? When this idea was first floated at a closed assay meeting, it was met with silence. If the patterns reflected not only terrestrial events, but also events on other planets, then the system recording these patterns must be incredibly sensitive, far more sensitive than any known human instrument. This meant that Atlas was no fluke, no strange comet. It was a phenomenon capable of detecting signals spreading through space like waves on a pond. And these waves could be precursors to all sorts of events, from magnetic storms to tectonic shifts, from solar flares to other cosmic fluctuations. But if this is true, then why does the tail sometimes take on shapes reminiscent not just of maps, but of human risk zones, as if it highlights what's important to us? Why does it depict precisely those regions where events are occurring within weeks? And why do the emerging patterns repeatedly coincide with precisely those zones where atmospheric currents or tectonic activity could cause problems for humanity? A key observation emerged when one of the researchers superimposed images of the tail onto models of global temperature change. It turned out that the brightness of certain sections of the tail correlated with areas predicted to experience sharp thermal stress spikes in the future. This was a turning point. For the first time, it became possible that the tail was recording not just events, but trends that were forming long before they manifested. At this point, Atlas ceased to be a mere prophet comet. It became a tool revealing the consequences of our own actions. But this was only the first level of understanding. Then came the second. One spectroscopy specialist noticed that the tail's shape sometimes changed, as if recording the events in real time. For example, when a powerful thermal front passed across the planet, the tail's structure shifted after a few days in a direction consistent with the propagation of these waves. This seemed to be a reaction. In other words, the tail could have been recording something that had already happened. But a few days later, the tail changed again, and this new pattern corresponded to a future increase in atmospheric pressure in a region that no one knew about at the time. It created a strange double mirror. The comet reflected both the past and the future. It revealed a chain of events linked by cause and effect relationships. But if this is true, then Atlas is actually demonstrating the structure of what we call a future attractor, a region into which a system of events is destined to fall under certain conditions. This is precisely how complex nonlinear systems behave in physics. They form patterns that, under certain conditions, become inevitable. So what does Atlas show us? Some scientists believe it's simply a reflection of future data. Others believe it's a probability map. But there's a third group, and their theory is far more disturbing. They believe the comet isn't just making predictions, it's writing a story that's already happened somewhere else, and these stories repeat themselves. Like cycles, like inevitability. If Atlas is an ancient object created by a long-vanished civilization, then perhaps it's just one of billions of such observers roaming the universe, recording the fates of planets. In that case, its patterns are a warning not of something that will happen for the first time, but of something that has happened many times before, on other worlds, in other systems. And if so, then perhaps she is not writing our future, and the scenario according to which other civilizations disappeared. And here, the main question arises. Does the tail show what is inevitable, or what we can still change? When the number of coincidences exceeded several dozen, scientists stopped arguing about the anomaly itself. The debate shifted to something else. What exactly is Comet Atlas trying to reveal? Catastrophes, magnetic storms, earthquakes, atmospheric shifts, cyclone formations, impending solar ejections, all of these had already appeared in the tail. But with each new cycle of the comet's approach to the sun, something even stranger occurred. The shape of the tail became clearer, not in terms of brightness, but in terms of structure. It was as if someone had increased the resolution of the image, bringing to the surface additional details that hadn't been there before. The first serious signal was the appearance of a shape resembling a huge crescent, The image was taken by 3 telescopes simultaneously in Chile, Canada, and Spain. In all cases, the pattern was identical, a long arc, widening toward the edges and narrowing in the center, like a giant gravitational wave passing through the planet's atmosphere. At first, it was thought to be an optical phenomenon. But 19 days later, a rare atmospheric event occurred in the southern hemisphere, a powerful air front that disrupted the usual wind circulation and triggered a chain of weather anomalies in Australia, Argentina, and Indonesia. This was precisely the shape of the aftermath area. Comet was right again. But soon the patterns began to take on even more precise outlines. One day, Atlas's tail took on a shape resembling a globe, only with a huge shadow obscuring the left hemisphere. This pattern remained undecipherable for almost 2 weeks, until one of the orbital observations revealed an anomalous increase in cosmic radiation fluxes over the central Atlantic. The images of the tail and the radiation map matched almost perfectly. This became the first official proof that Atlas was detecting the intentions of future cosmic events long before they became measurable by Earth's instruments. But then something happened that no one expected. One of the photographs of the comet's tail revealed neither maps nor lines. A sign appeared. It resembled a perfect rhombus, elongated upward, a perfect geometric shape, not found in similar tail structures of any known comet. When the image was processed with highly precise contrast algorithms, another pattern emerged within the rhombus, a triple arc, closed into a ring. Scientists are stumped. The physics of nature doesn't create perfectly symmetrical shapes in plasma flows, especially multi-layered ones. Then theoretical physicist Linda Howe proposed a theory that was initially dismissed as crazy, that it could be a signature, a marker, a label, that Atlas wasn't just a vehicle of the future, but part of a system that leaves identical symbols where an important event is about to occur. At first, it sounded like pure fantasy, but then, in the archival data, they discovered something no one was looking for. An identical symbol, the same diamond with an arc within it, appeared in the tails of 2 interstellar objects passing through the system thousands of years ago. Ancient Greek astronomers wrote about this, describing a heavenly sign that preceded a powerful solar storm that destroyed some of the ancient Greek instruments. This symbol was considered mystical. Now, it has become one of the most important discoveries in history. It turned out that Atlas carries the same pattern that appeared only before global natural restructurings. But what exactly does this sign mean now? The answer was far from comforting. After extensive comparisons, it turned out that the diamond shape matches the distribution of the future solar wind intersection. In other words, Atlas shows the location where a sharp change in solar activity will occur in a few months. This event has already begun to be called a threshold. Too many variables coincided, too much symmetry, too much precision. But the most frightening thing is the next structure that appeared in the tail 9 days later. It was a map. And not just any map. It was a precise diagram of the Earth's magnetosphere, with just one difference. The diagram contained a huge hole, a discontinuity in the magnetic field that doesn't yet exist in reality. It wasn't a forecast. It was a warning. Scientists are shocked. For a comet's tail to reveal Earth's magnetosphere, the object would have to interact with magnetic fields that it physically cannot see. This is no longer just an astronomical observation. It suggests that Atlas has access to information that a normal natural object cannot sense. And no one knows how this is possible. There are even hypotheses that the comet is part of a vast ancient observation system, created by an unknown civilization that vanished millions of years ago. This system could have recorded critical points in the development of various planets, recording not only catastrophes, but also the very trajectories of future scenarios. It's as if someone long ago created a network of sensors across the galaxy, and Atlas is one of them. If this is so, then the main question arises. What does the diamond that appeared in her tail mean? Is this a warning, a signal of something to come, or the final page of a book we're still learning to read? And if Atlas writes our future in the sky, then who is holding the pen?